as Nick said, it's almost a kind of what is to be done session, but more particularly on the agents of what is to be done, and the agents, as it were, that we're part of, the social movements. So the main purpose of this session is to discuss what, as social movement activists and engaged scholars, we've learned and are learning, continuing to learn about social movements as agents of sustained social transformation. So beyond protest, beyond mobilization, how about the actual lasting change that we can bring about, including what can be done to increase and deepen our power to bring about lasting change in the conditions and self-organization of the poor and marginalized. Just to put ourselves in context and to do so soberly, 20 years ago or thereafter, social movements were described by the New York Times as the world's second superpower, which made us all feel rather good. That was after the big demonstration on the Iraq war, which we did not stop. So we've got to be sober in a balance sheet of what's the situation today, what have we learned in the past 20 years? Clearly a lot of defeats as well. Maybe I'm speaking just from the British context, but all over there've been defeats and difficulties and repression. But on the other hand, there's also been achievements, victories, and lessons learned, and improvements in our own ways of organizing. So what also the obstacles that we face, including internally in our own organizations? And then looking to the future, how do we turn our abilities to protest and to mobilize on the streets into a sustained shift in the balance of power and lasting economic and social alternatives? So, you know, to help us answer these questions, we're really pleased that we've got together, or that the people have been willing to come, to make up such a panel of great activists for this session, whose experiences on the front line and also in a reflective sort of mode collectively will help us develop and answer these questions together. I'll provide longer sort of biographies as we go through the session, but just quickly an overview. We've got Kali Akuno, who will open up, a community organizer and radical thinker from Jackson, Mississippi. Sara Abbas, an activist in support of the Sudanese social movements in Sudan. And Mitzi Jonelle-Tan, a climate activist from the Philippines. And Ruth Nyambura, an African ecofeminist, organizer from Kenya. So welcome to the panel, really great to have you. And it's going to be exciting talking to you and the audience joining in at a certain point. But we want your questions and thoughts online anyway, and we're going to do various polls. I'll just explain that format a bit more clearly. The format of the session is that we'll have an initial quick exchange with everyone on the panel. I'll just pose them a question and they'll have 2 minutes to respond. I mean, it's not a game, but we just got to watch time, although we can be relaxed. Then inputs of 7 to 8 minutes from each of the panelists, and then a round of exchanges and conversation between the panel, and then an open Q&A with all of you, the participants. And there's a growing number. I can see the figures clocking up in front of me. So please use the Q&A tab if you have questions for the panelists, and use the chat for your own comments and suggestions, which obviously we'll also bring into the discussion. If you'd like to live tweet the event, and we hope you will, please use the TNI social media hashtag, which is #StateOfTheWorld, all one word. So before we get going, we'd all like to hear a bit more about each other. And although we're asking you in the chat to say where you're from, we've also created a poll that you can find by clicking on the Menti link. I don't know too much about that, but it does work, the Menti link. We'd like to know, this is really the question to you all, we'd like to know what issues in your own activism, your own movement organizing, is focusing. What are the issues you're focusing on through your own activism and movement organizing? So if you can do that, and then that'll kind of help us have a sense of where you're coming from, what the issues are that you you care about. And I think somehow that'll emerge in some sort of balloon. I'm not quite sure, but let's just wait and see, or not, but I was going to say as we wait, but maybe we'll just carry on with the panelists, and then this sort of report back on your quick, just give us like a line or two, just, you know, briefly, so that it can immediately feed in. So the question I just wanted to ask all of the panelists is to just share what they see as the distinctive source of power of social movements. You know, in other words, what forms of transformative power do social movements uniquely exert as distinct from political parties or the state, or, you know, what's distinctive about social movements, so that we can focus our discussion around the power of social movements with some shared notion of what it is about social movements that that gives them a unique source of transformative power. So, Kali, just a 2-3 minute response to that question, just in your own way. And obviously, it's an open question. We're not expecting you to give the definition in 2-3 minutes. Kali?
Well, I'm here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to folks wherever you may be. Speaking to you from Jackson, Mississippi, where we've gone a month without portable water, basically in about 4 months under some acute boil water notices. And we've been working diligently to try to serve our community in the midst of this particular crisis. So if you hear some exhaustion in my voice, it is real. Just in terms of dealing with the situation here on a mass level. But to the question, you know, I would say looking here in the U.S. context over the last 20 years, the greatest power I would say social movements have had here has been to expand people's imaginations and their horizons, right? Far more beyond just what might take place within the confines of people thinking about policy change, you know, for kind of social goods or material goods. What the social movements have done, I think at their best, is put certain issues, fundamental issues, kind of squarely back on the table. And what I mean by that, coming out of, you know, the Occupy movement, which, you know, has kind of emerged from the Indignados movement and other movements before, but here in the United States, we've had since then a real conversation about class inequality, and the possibilities of transformation. That wasn't a dominant theme in the United States in any form or fashion before that, right? And a lot of the politics historically in the United States is about kind of removing the friction and the tensions and the contradictions about class. So you hear in the United States this mythical middle class projection and aspiration that all the politicians, you know, the Democrats or the Republicans, are always trying to speak to. The Occupy movement came in and shattered that myth in a lot of fundamental ways. And it did it by a lot of innovative kind of use of both technology, but also of imagery, right? And evoking inequality and reminding people of inequality and demonstrating to many people the degrees and depth of inequality. And it came up with a pretty, how would you call it? A pretty concise definition. I don't think it was necessarily the right one, but that's beyond the point. But it drew up this good analogy of the 99% versus the 1%. uh, uh, and was really honing in and looking for a formula. And this part I do agree with. It really honed in on trying to build a very broad unity amongst all the different folks who labor in different ways, and to say that we all have something in common, and we should unite on that common basis. And that just kind of opened up the imagination. You could say a similar thing in the United States has also occurred about climate change and the threat of climate change and the urgency of climate change. And then there's been some very profound awakenings that have come from the social movement about hierarchy, and then also about about sex and gender in the United States. There's been a profound backlash on the latter by the right, which we can talk about very profoundly. The attacks on women's right to choose, or folks who can bear children, their right to choose, right to medical care in a number of different ways. And what I mean by that, so folks are clear, there's been a lot of gains, primarily by trans people in the United States on a social level as a result of the social movement in terms of representation and inclusion, but there's been a profound backlash as well. And that's playing out materially where a number of states are refusing people medical treatment and things of that nature. But what has opened up, and then I'll stop, again, I would highlight is all of these movements have expanded the imagination, I would say profoundly, of large sectors of the American public without so much really digging in around particular policy formations. Policy can emerge from that, but they've transformed the imagination first and foremost.
That's great, Kali. That's the role of social movements in expanding the imagination, and that's a source of power, an important power. So Sara, your 2-3 minutes worth, and then everybody will be able to expand in their own contributions.
Thank you so much. I'm really I'm excited to be on a panel with people that I admire very much, and I'm really looking forward to also hearing from the audience. I'm sure they're involved in some very interesting social movements as well around the world. Very briefly, I think, for me, I will mainly draw today on the Sudanese social movement landscape, particularly since 2018, when, what we call the December Revolution in Sudan started, and it's ongoing, even though it's fallen out of the media. But I think for me, looking at social movements, not just there, but also in the region, because our region has seen a lot of social movements over the last 10 to 12 years. I think what's very distinctive about, or what is distinctive about social movements is that where they get their inspiration from, or where they are affected by, and that's their connection to the lives of, at their best, their connection to the lives of people who are struggling. And that influences them in many different ways, I think, that make them distinctive. And one of those ways is that we see increasingly the kind of breadth of different groups that are coming together, sometimes temporarily, sometimes in these fragile alliances, but raising these common demands that have to do with people's lives. And so I see a change, or I see a shift in the ability to mobilize people from larger groups than what at least me as a student of social movement had been taught. In Sudan, if you look historically, they talk about ethnic mobilization, they talk about tribal mobilization, but we see social movements being able to mobilize groups that we were told could not come together and meet common demands. And I think that's very interesting, and we can kind of try to talk a bit about why that might be the case. And it's not just in Sudan, I see that happening in many places. The other aspect of it is the way social movements learn. I think for me, that is also something distinctive about them. Because social movements are often made in the struggle itself, the learning tends to take particular shapes and tends to be quite rapid. And it tends to be in relation to sometimes it tends to be in relation to historical things, regional, for example, lessons. And I can talk a little bit more, for example, of how what happened in Egypt influenced the movement in Sudan a little bit later. But also it tends to be in relations to contradictions and dilemmas, because of course, bringing these groups together also brings together a set of contradictions. And these movements tend to be under pressure from the outside and the inside. And that gives birth to a certain modes of learning that I think are quite distinctive.
Okay, Sara, that's really, really interesting. And I think you're absolutely right about that learning, the distinctive forms of learning, which in a way feeds into a particular kind of power and self-awareness. So the next speaker actually hasn't arrived, Mitzi Jonelle-Tan, who I think she was anyway going to have to come from another conference. So I think we can expect her, but she hasn't arrived yet. So I'll go on to Ruth, but in the meantime, just alert one of my colleagues at the TNI, Daniel Chavez from Uruguay, and therefore from Latin America, as to whether he'd be willing to answer this question and say something about the distinctive character of the power of social movements that he's learned from observing the situation in Latin America, where obviously there's a constant tension between political parties and social movements. So I'm just giving a warning to Daniel. I mean, I hope you don't mind, Daniel. I hope you're there. Anyway, now let's go on to Ruth.
Okay, so when I think about this, the very distinct nature of movements, and especially for me, witnessing the last 10, 15 years in this continent, where the consolidation of power, agrarian capital, sort of like a new wave of land grabs, commodification and enclosures of the commons. I think about the social movements that have not just emerged in the last 10, 15 years, but also historically how they borrow, how they take pride in the previous movements, decolonial movements, anti-colonial movements, actually. And I think about their transnational and transversal nature, the ability to break down, the borders, the colonial borders that we have inherited as formerly colonized people, the ability to work across movements. So having labor, having unions, having, feminists, women human rights defenders, having, peasants coming collectively to work together, in ways as Sara has just said, people who we've historically been told that they cannot work together, but actually tearing down the curtain or the wall that we have inherited, from colonialism, but also with our own post-colonial governments. And also I think about the ability to globalize local issues, thinking about commodification and how social movements on the continent have been able to make links or continue to make links, with movements in Latin America, movements in Asia, First Nations in what is called the US or, Untitled Island, and also, of course, the ability, to borrow from Benedict Anderson, in terms of thinking about the concept of imagined communities, and then going further with the ability, the potential of making political alliances against power structures and thinking about horizontal comradeship. And I think that is something that is absolutely distinct and amazing about not just the movements that have emerged in the last 10, 15 years, at least on the continent of Africa, but also thinking about the long histories of transnational and transversal solidarities that has always really existed, among oppressed people of the world. Yeah.
Thanks, Ruth. Well, your answer there is very close to the spirit of the TNI, because it's really been since the emergence of social movements as the third superpower, as it were, that the TNI, as the transnational institute, has come into its own. So I think you're really right about that transnational linking that social movements are particularly capable of, because they're not tied to the structures of the nation state. So Mitzi sent us a note. She is coming. She'll be a bit later. She'll be 30 minutes later from the beginning, so she should be here fairly soon. But is Danielle around or not? Maybe I've not he's not been able to answer. He didn't know he was going to do this, so maybe it's a bit unfair to ask him. I've not had any reply. Anyway, let's move on now to the main sessions itself. So I'll just introduce the first speaker is going to be Sara. So Sara is a political scientist and researcher active in Sudan solidarity work, as we've heard. Her current focus is researching the imaginations and collective practices, including, I guess, the learning practices that have arisen in the sit-in spaces, that is the protester camps, in Sudan's ongoing revolution. Sara is a contributor to Diversity on Common Ground, 10 Perspectives on Contemporary Feminism, and to A Region in Revolt, mapping the recent uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. So Sara, if you could describe the state of your struggle and the kind of learning that's emerged from that, it'd be wonderful. And I'm going to try and, if you don't mind, if you could limit it to 8 minutes or so. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I will try my best. Sudan is usually difficult to limit to 8 minutes because not much is known about it outside Sudan. But I will try to very briefly speak from the perspective of someone who has been a part of different points, different struggles within Sudan, but also now as a member of the diaspora, really active and engaged in supporting the ongoing revolution. Many people don't know that it is ongoing because it dropped off the international media maybe a couple of years back. But actually the social movements are still very, very powerful in Sudan and still struggling and fighting and making demands. So I want to speak a little bit about that, but also really what are some of the important things, that lessons from that movement, but also what have been the barriers and the obstacles, because they have been very, very real as well. I think I might be a bit biased, but I think the movement in Sudan today is one of the most dynamic social movements anywhere in the world. And there's several reasons that I think of this. One of them is that in the face of a extremely repressive apparatus, state apparatus, the movement has not only managed to renew itself through very real challenges, but has also, to my sometimes to my shock, has remained a non-violent movement. And I'm not saying non-violence here as a way of kind of putting it above, because I think different struggles require different tools. But I think what is fascinating about that is that there has been an understanding at the heart of that movement that because this country has seen such an intense degree of violence and suffering, that somehow the change has to show new ways in which people can relate to each other. And I think this has been really key. I think there's a whole session we can have about this question of nonviolence and the way it is spoken of in the liberal media. I think what the movement in Sudan shows is that nonviolence itself as a tool is a way of these new imaginations that Kali has spoken about, is a way of engendering these kinds of new imaginations. So what I wanted to speak about is really very briefly to just say in a couple of minutes, the broad, the main events in relation to this revolution. So in December, we will be entering, it's the 4th year anniversary of what we call in Sudan, the December Revolution, which began in December 2018. It began with mainly school students, high school students mostly, going out to protest in cities like Damascene, Atbara, and other cities. And at the heart of it, and in its beginning, was protests about the cost of living, specifically the cost of bread, which is kind of the thing that people feel most directly often in Sudanese households, the rise in the cost of bread. And from there, it spread very quickly to many, many cities and regions around the country, and also to the capital city, Khartoum, which historically has been at the heart of the previous uprisings that have happened. So Sudan is a country that has a very rich history of uprisings. If you could summarize in a way its post-colonial history since 1956, it has been essentially military dictatorships that are brought down by popular uprisings, you have multi-party governments, civilian governments coming in for brief periods of time, and then you get another coup and another military government and another civil uprising and so forth. So we have the 1964 revolution, October Revolution, as we call it, and we also have the 1985 Intifada. But there are many ways in which this current movement is similar and different from those. So just very briefly, the movement, which in its sort of early stages in 2019 particularly, was led by the Sudanese Professionals Associations, the SPA, which is it was a band at the time, a band alliance of different unions and professional associations. And they did a lot. I mean, at the time, they were the protest leaders in the sense that they organized the schedules. They actually also very much promoted this principle of nonviolence, and they got information out. In April, the movement managed, in part through a mass occupation, a sit-in that happened in front of the military general command, to bring down the al-Bashir government. I don't say the regime because it was very clear to the movement at the time that the regime remains, but its figureheads fell. The military then took over again, and following many events, there was a power sharing deal that was reached in August 2019 that basically would put in place a period of power sharing between civilians, a transitional civilian government, which was a demand of the movement, and the military, as well as some of the militias affiliated with it. This transitional period went on for 2 years, but was ended by a coup in October 25th of last year. So in October of this year, we're coming into the 1-year anniversary actually of this coup. What the coup did is it had the effect of re-radicalizing the movement, I would say. Essentially, it had never gone away. However, there was hope, despite the unpopularity of the deal, that this, predominantly civilian government would be able to tackle the main demands of the movement. And the main demands included an end to the war in Western Sudan at that point in particular, but also included dealing with the economic situation, which had been in free fall for a long time, and people just could not make ends meet anymore. And the rural livelihoods had been destroyed. The urban poor, the number of the urban poor was massively expanding and so forth. And unfortunately, the civilian government itself was a letdown because it focused a lot of its efforts on dealing with what's called the international community, but really dealing with the World Bank and the IMF in terms of dealing with the issues of debt and questions of how to reintegrate back into the global markets, essentially, and not really dealing with the questions of inequality, which had really started the revolution to begin with. Meanwhile, the military continued to play a very big role, too big of a role in the government, and repression continued. So activists continued to be thrown in jail, to be hurt, and conflict also continued in parts of the country. So what I want to do, because I only have really 3 minutes, so I want to really, instead of going too much on the events, I want to talk about, what are some of the main features of those social movements. So I say social movement, but of course it's several different streams within that social movement. And while the demands are similar, at least the main demands, for example, one of the key demands of the social movements in Sudan is a civilian government. And this sounds like not much, but in a country where the military has ruled for most of its post-colonial history, this is a key demand. And it continues to be. But also there's a demand to deal with the essential looting of the country's resources. Sudan is a country that exports a lot of gold, but most of it is smuggled out by the state and by the militias and so forth. And so it is actually dealing with the resource exploitation, dealing with the laws that discriminate against women and minorities, and dealing with essentially the inequality within social life. As I mentioned earlier, the things to note about it is in this movement, we've seen a depth and breadth of participation like nothing we've seen before. So in 1964 and in 1985 in Sudan, these uprisings tended to be led by the unions and the professional associations and were centered in the capital city. But while Khartoum still plays a key role, different regions in the country continue to be involved, and the struggle takes place in localized ways. So for example, in the communities where you have a lot of extraction from the mining sector, you have struggles around mining that predate the revolution, but that were intensified by the revolution. The ability to sustain the movement has also required a lot of creativity and a lot of memory as well. And the memory is not only of all the victims of this regime, right? And even the idea of victim is not just the people that have been killed by the regime or that have died in its wars, but the people that have died as a result of the policy of impoverization and the policy of, land dispossession and so forth. So the memory is kept alive in many, many different ways. But also, while there are many streams within this movement, the class divisions are also apparent. So the leadership now in this phase of the revolution is with what we call resistance committees, which is a vast network of groups that have sprung up in neighborhoods. Some of them predate the revolution, but most of them got formed within the revolution, and they organize locally. And these reflect in many different ways, they reflect the conditions of the neighborhoods and the communities that they come from and the issues that they come from. So in a way, that has been how this movement has been sustained, because they are able to be everywhere at the same time. But of course, that includes a lot of negotiation, because you have many class interests and many regional interests also reflected within these. The professionals and some of the groups that are based in Khartoum, there is, like in Latin America, you see a very strong division between the social movements and the political parties, the opposition political parties, who by and large want to reach a deal with both the international community and the military, while, for example, the resistance committees have refused to negotiate at this stage, especially based on the experience of negotiation before, which failed and which did not end the crisis. And the learning is done in extremely creative ways, but also the memory is carried. So I'm amazed. Sudan is a country that has maybe 67% or close to 75% actually of the population is under the age of 24. So this is quite amazing. And that means that the element of youth, we talk about youth, you don't see them very much reflected within these political parties, and you don't see them reflected within the negotiations, but they are the ones that are actually leading these movements, right? Because they are the ones who are most affected by what is happening. But you also see, a reflection sometimes of the power of the movements that are centered in Khartoum. So the Khartoum resistance committees tend to have a higher voice, and this is kind of a reproduction of the power structure, the colonial power structure that is still in the country. So this is something that social movements also we have to speak about, some of the ways in which they can also reproduce the things that they are fighting against. In terms of obstacles and barriers, I think, there have been a lot of discussion. The Sudanese uprising started around the same time as the Algerian uprising. The Algerian uprising started a few months later. And at the time I was told by my Algerian comrades, you're so lucky you have the SPA, you have a leadership, and that helps. But I would say the experience from Sudan shows that different models of leadership have different advantages and disadvantages. What happened was that the SPA was able to speak on behalf of the movement, but when the time came to sign the agreement, they also had the power to do that, and that was not an agreement that was supported by the vast majority of the people. While now the resistance committees are there and they are leading, but there are so many of them that, of course, as much as they have done a very good job of speaking with one voice, it means that they are not considered one representative of the people, right? So this is, I think it's interesting to think, I think what is most dynamic is when you see leadership is as flexible and able to shift actually based on the circumstances. The danger of co-optation, there are always people who, and I think the international community plays a strong role in this, in choosing who within these movements they can co-opt to speak on behalf of them and to make deals on behalf of these movements. And we see that in Sudan as well. There is a particular elite that, as much as it wants the military to go, is invested in the idea of stability and order, and is invested in a conversation with the power structure. And that is has been a big obstacle in Sudan to making these demands actually take root. The economic situation, I would be interested to hear what others have to say, but often world markets actually, I would say, punish countries for having vibrant social movements and for having social upheavals. So what we see happening in Sudan is an explosion in the rate of inflation, actually, since the beginning of the revolution, and a deterioration in the livelihoods of people. And this has been, I think this is critical, because while the resistance committees in particular and other groups that are part of the revolutionary forces, as we call them in Sudan, have been able to begin developing charters and new political models of governance, we haven't done as well in thinking of new economic models that can sustain us during this period. So the crisis of cost of living is massively causing a lot of suffering in Sudan to this day. And then the question of who speaks on behalf of these movements, again, I think I want to keep harping on this because it's very important. I think in this sense, the development industry, the international community, the diplomatic world is a counter-revolutionary force, in the sense that they are constantly looking for partners and constantly looking for people they can work with, give grants to within these social movements, as a way, I think, of depoliticizing them, actually. It's not as a way of connecting with them in any ways. And then the media. So as much as within Sudan, we've done a really, really good job of connecting, much better than in previous years, I would say, for one, the rural movements and the rural communities still don't have that much access to the media and are still not given enough visibility. In addition, cross-border communication is weak. Even within the region, Sudan is a predominantly Arabic-speaking country. And so we are within the sort of Arab regional media framework. We still view struggles through, Al Jazeera and through these massive media conglomerates, which shape a lot of how we think about what is happening within our countries. So I think the question of alternative media and trans-border learning still is critical to the question of building solidarity, particularly on issues that face, I think, not just Sudan, but the whole region. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Sara, that was fantastic. You said that the movements in Sudan are some of the most creative that you've come across, and you've certainly conveyed that fabulously. So thanks so much. And there's so many issues that you've raised that also connect with other speakers. I'm sure Kali could say something about the whole issue of alternative economic models. And I think all your points about the way in which movements can prefigure in some way new relations, as you say, in relation to non-violence, I think connects with Kali's points about imagination. And now the next speaker, luckily Mitzi Jonelle-Tan has joined us, and you talked, Sara, about youth, and Mitzi is very much in the lead of the youth movement on climate change in the Philippines. And we're really pleased you've come. I just wanted to also say that Daniel, who would have been able to say something, but he was just finishing another meeting, but maybe he'll come in later. He's come in on the chat. But anyway, Mitzi, it's wonderful to have you. And one of the other speakers early on, when we asked about the sources of power, it was Kali, I think, said the ways in which social movements bring to the fore issues that are otherwise, being ignored or being given very low priority. And certainly we can say that the movement that you're very much part of, the Fridays for the Future, has brought climate change to the fore in a way that, and the urgency of climate change to the fore in the way that no other movement has. So Mitzi, over to you for 8 or so minutes. Sorry to restrict you, but if we begin like that, and then there'll be a time to come back. Oh, wait a minute, I need to introduce you. Sorry, just 1 second. I want to introduce you in a bit more depth. I'm sorry about that, I got carried away just by seeing you. So Mitzi is a full-time climate justice activist based in Metro Manila in the Philippines. She's the convener and international spokesperson of Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, YACAP, the Fridays for the Future, FFF of the Philippines. She's also an organizer with FFF International and FFF MAPA, Most Affected Peoples and Areas, that means, making sure that voices from the Global South especially are heard, amplified and given space. So Mitzi, now to give you space.
Hello, everyone. I'm so sorry for being late. I am currently in another conference about climate and about the state of the movement also, which is actually really interesting. And something that I noticed, I'll be sharing the timeline and the state of the climate movement as I joined it. So of course, when I started out, this was in early 2019. It was just in the Philippines. Across the world, youth climate movements started spontaneously popping up. So it wasn't coordinated. I'm sure everyone knows the story of how Greta Thunberg started striking in front of her parliament, and that sparked a lot of movements across Europe and then eventually across the world. But even it's important to note that even before this moment, many others, especially from the global south, were already talking about climate justice and environmental justice and trying to bring the climate crisis into the forefront. Most countries, and most of those initiatives started in the global south. And it's very important to pay homage to that, because I've noticed that a lot of people think that the climate movement started with the Fridays for Future movement, which, although I am part of, it didn't start there. It started long before, especially by our indigenous people, our small farmers, our small fisher folk. So it's really important to remember that. In the Philippines, we're a country that's battered by the climate crisis. I grew up seeing it firsthand, but then there's not a lot of climate education that's empowering and actually talks about what we're experiencing as a country. A lot of what we've experienced, my climate education is basically about polar bears and melting ice caps, not about what you're already experiencing. And so that was one of the biggest struggles in the Philippines, that lack of climate education and climate awareness. Because even if you had the privilege to study, it's not something that's talked about in an empowering way. At most, they'll teach you that reducing, reusing, and recycling and individual lifestyle change is the answer to the climate crisis, which it isn't. And then there's an added struggle in the Philippines where it's dangerous to be an activist, especially an environmental defender and environmental activist in the Philippines. We're one of the most dangerous countries in the world for environmental defenders. And there is a stigma around activism because of that. So a lot of young people are afraid to join activism or are not allowed to join activism by their parents. And so a lot of our work really was about going to schools, going to students, showing them that climate activism isn't scary, that it is something that we should all be partaking. And then the pandemic started. So we just started in 2019 and then the pandemic happened half a year later. And suddenly the international climate movement, Fridays for Future, of the youth movement, that was so focused on doing actions in their own countries, couldn't do that because it wasn't safe at that time because of the COVID pandemic. And suddenly we had this opportunity where there were no physical barriers because everything was online. Everyone could join in on each other. And so I think that was a crucial moment where we started to learn what international solidarity looks like, what it truly, really means to be in solidarity, especially with the global south. When I joined the Fridays for Future network, a lot of the conversations around climate change, this was in early 2020, was that the climate crisis is a problem of the future and not something that's already happening today. And so that ignores and erases the experiences of the global south people who are already most impacted today. And it frames it in a way that leaves behind the people most marginalized. And so a lot of the work that was being done then, because we were suddenly able to have conversations with each other, communicate with each other, coordinate together, a lot of effort was put into and energy was put into changing that narrative to make sure that people now understand what climate change is. People now understand what that it's an emergency. The next step was to understand that it's already here, that it is a problem of the present, that it is something that's already impacting people. And now the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement also helped the climate movement really understand how it's supposed to be intersectional, how the racial injustice, class injustice, gender injustice, how all these injustices amplify the climate crisis and are amplified by the climate. A very concrete example of this is how in 2013 in the Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan devastated a community in the Philippines, and because of that devastation, long after the typhoon was gone or the hurricane was gone, young girls and women were forced into prostitution because there was no other choice. And so that is what the climate crisis looks like. And so a lot of the work that we're doing here in the Philippines and internationally is changing and connecting those dots so that people understand it. Because that is also how you start to push policies, by having that critical mass opinion and that critical mass pressure, that public pressure, working with the people who are lobbying inside. Because I wasn't able to answer the sources of power question earlier, I'd like to say it now because I think it's so important that we connect with the most marginalized people. I think that is the source of the power. When you connect and let the most marginalized people lead. So these are our farmers, our fisher folk, our indigenous peoples, our workers. And sorry, when I say farmers and fisher folk, I mean the small farmers and small fisher folk. I know that in the global north, it's not the same as in the Philippines, where our farmers and fisher folk are the poorest sectors of society, despite our country being an agricultural and island country. So there's definitely a mismatch there. Now, what's happening is that we're facing this moment where the climate movement is becoming more, at least the pockets I'm in, maybe I'm in an echo chamber, but the climate movement is becoming more and more intersectional and pointing out that the reason behind the climate crisis is the capitalist and profit-oriented system that we have today. That's the fascism and the repression that the global south is experiencing is because we're threatening that business as usual, and we're threatening that profit. And that's what has led us to the climate crisis. And now it's about making sure that we stand in solidarity. And what does that mean? What does that look like? And all these questions, which is difficult in the global movement. And I don't claim to understand and know how to do this. At least in the Philippines, we work heavily with our communities. And then something that we're doing now more and more in the international movement is that if there is a fossil fuel company, let's say in France, with an oil project in Eastern Africa, that's the East African crude oil pipeline. The activists in France and the activists in East Africa, they work together to do a joint campaign so that it is a full circle campaign from the country that's causing it to the country that's being impacted. And it's so important that the country that is impacted, that global South countries aren't reduced to statistics and sad stories, but rather showing the resistance in these countries and making sure that this resistance is highlighted and supported. And this looks different in every single country. And whenever I'm tasked to talk about the global climate movement, it's so difficult because it's so nuanced and different in every country. In the Philippines, a lot of our work is making sure that people understand what the climate crisis is, that we bring young people and students and more privileged people to communities like the indigenous people, small farmers, small fisher folk, the workers, and that we learn from them and that we support their campaigns and we ensure that their campaigns are amplified by the climate justice movement, because everything can be connected to the climate movement. You know, food insecurity, the energy crisis, poverty, the climate crisis amplifies all of that. And so it is also as the climate crisis amplifies these problems, it's also the climate movement's duty to amplify the campaigns against these problems. And that, I think, is the beauty of the climate movement also, is that it's very clear, it's very easy to show to people that the reason behind the climate crisis is the overproduction, the profit-oriented system that we have. And that is something that we need to pinpoint and really change. And that's how, and that is how we start building relationships and connections. I think beyond something that the Fridays for Future and the climate movement needs to do better even is that beyond campaigning and mobilizing people in the streets, it's about organizing, it's about bringing new people in, it's about making sure people who don't understand climate yet can come in, even if they don't know anything. You know, it's not something that just happens in Fridays for Future, and it's not that rampant in the pockets that I'm in of Fridays for Future, but I feel like a sickness within activism is this gatekeeping culture and this cancel culture that if you're not progressive enough, then you're not good enough to be an activist, or you have to have a certain level of knowledge to become an activist. And in the Philippines, I'm seeing this culture in different forms of activism. And it's something that we can't afford to have because no one was born a revolutionary. I used to be so apathetic and apolitical. If the activists around me gave up on me those several years ago, then I wouldn't be here today and we wouldn't be organizing more and more people. And so that, I think, is the learnings that we have to take away. And it's a difficult conversation to have, and it's difficult to navigate around that global movement, that global theme. But what I know for sure is that international solidarity will always help in every single issue, in every single injustice, especially with the climate crisis being a global problem. International solidarity is the thing that we need, and making sure that the most marginalized people are the ones leading the solutions. Thank you.
Great, Mitzi. That's really good and really good takeaways, you know, of the importance of intersectionality, which I think will come up again and again. And our next speaker, Ruth, will be very much emphasizing that, I guess, as an eco-feminist, but also your emphasis on reaching out, not having this parochial sort of holier than thou gatekeeper approach, and the importance of reaching marginalized and poor people. So thanks a lot for that. That's a really good contribution. I hope you can stay with us to be part of the discussion. Great. Okay, Ruth. So let me welcome, and great to hear you earlier. So looking forward to this fuller presentation. So Ruth Nyambura is a Kenyan feminist and organizer whose research has primarily focused on the agrarian political economy, ecology in Africa and the global south. She's recently been the acting global coordinator of the Hands Off Mother Earth campaign, HOME, a global movement resisting geoengineering technologies, as well as other false solutions to the climate crisis. She's the founder and convener of the African Ecofeminist Collective. So Ruth, great to have you and to hear your contribution.
Thank you so much for having me. So I think it's very important, first of all, to begin with the context under which I like to call them new feminists working on, the politics of the gendered agrarian commons on the continent of Africa. So at present, there's a drought in Eastern and the Horn of Africa after 4 years of below average rainfall. Around 18 million people are facing severe hunger in Somalia, Kenya, where I'm based in Nairobi, and Ethiopia. At the same time, inflation is at an all-time high across the continent. There have been food protests in Kenya, for example, in the last few months with the Njaa Revolution, Njaa, which is a Kiswahili term that basically means the hunger revolution led by the urban poor. There have been protests in the last few months. And of course, the continent is facing a very severe debt crisis. We're actually calling it a second form of structural adjustment programs, where since 2020, since the beginning of the pandemic, we've had the IMF. A lot of African governments have been forced, rather, by circumstances to go to the IMF in terms of loans. And what we are seeing in the last 2-3 days with a new government in Kenya, we have a new government as of Tuesday this week. The new government has actually removed the subsidies on food and fuel. And actually in the last 2 days, the price of petrol went up from around, $1.5 for a liter, and now it's about $1.8 for a liter. This has all happened in the last 2 days. So you can imagine the level of crisis in Kenya, for example. But this is something being witnessed across the continent, including Zambia, which is facing a very severe crisis at this particular moment. At the same time, not in the last decade, we've seen rising fundamentalisms, in the form of like theocratic fascism meets neoliberalism, meets militarization, and new enclosures of the commons. And so to go very, very specifically, in this same period of time, we've seen, across the continent, legislation, whether at the national, various national governments, but also specifically within regional economic commissions such as COMESA, which is a common market for Eastern and Southern Africa, and the East African Community, where there has been legislation passed to criminalize the rights of smallholder farmers, peasant farmers, or just farmers in general to save, sell, and exchange their seed. At the very same time, in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen the rise of, investments by not just multinational corporations such as Bayer, Monsanto, Yara, but we've also seen specifically, governments in West Asia / Middle East, I'll use West Asia for now, Japan, Brazil, actually investing in land on the continent, thinking about, and this is in the form of, growth corridors such as the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania, a very huge, mixture of investment vehicles in the forms of infrastructure, in the form of irrigation schemes, in the form of monoculture agricultural projects, as well as Pro-Savannah, which was actually the largest agricultural investment project on the continent of Africa, and one of the largest in Africa, which was, between Brazil and Japan. And actually, one of the things is that I think that we don't speak enough about Pro-Savannah is that, a group, a transnational group, social movements based on the continent of Africa, with support from movements in Brazil and also Japan, were able to defeat the largest agricultural investment project on the continent of Africa. So this is basically the context under which, ecofeminist movements are operating within the continent at the moment. But importantly, to think about this new movements, right? To think about how previous movements, fighting, the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements in Africa, right? And also the movements against, at the early onset of structural adjustment programs and these new forms of commodification are actually antecedents, to the present movements that we see, but also with the militarization that we are seeing, for example, we already see how the criminalization of environmental rights defenders in South Africa presents a very particular case in point. We've seen, not just like the feminists or the women environmental rights defenders, but also the criminalization of movements such as Abalali Basim Jondolo, right? So state criminalization of movements around land, around food, but also movements basically challenging the commodification and the enclosures of the commons. So it's important to think about this present moment and the new movements that we have, basically as a long line of resistance dating back to the colonial period on the continent of Africa. So basically, the political struggles over the last 100 years on the continent and the forms and structures under which they emerged. So basically, the new ecofeminist movements, continue to wage basically a battle, over the gendered commons. So basically, the long interrelated and the long histories are still unfolding with regards to the commodification. So in terms of lessons that have emerged, and this goes back to my very first, when I spoke earlier, the transnational nature of the work. For those of us who are on the left, there's always that saying that capital knows no borders, knows no boundaries. So we must organize, like there are no borders and there are no boundaries. And this is what has emerged. So one of the things that we've seen in the last 10 years is the emergence of, transnational ecofeminist movements or women's movements around struggles over the gendered commons. So we have the African Ecofeminist Collective, which is a collective that I am part of. We have Warming, which is a collective working in, at least half of the countries on the continent of Africa, basically challenging, extractivism, or basically challenging mining projects across the continent. But also we have groups like the Southern African Rural Women's Assembly working across, the Southern African space. And this in itself not only speaks to the power of, the idea that we reject the colonial borders, we reject the boundaries that have been set for us by capital and by our own governments. But also, as Sara was saying something very interesting around, the possibilities of learning. What do we learn from one another? What do these movements learn from one another? How do they draw strength and power from one another, and how does this politics of working transnationally across borders, how then does it enable us, to pull together the limited resources that we have? Because that is a reality. The resources in terms of challenging power are very, very limited. And especially for movements that refuse basically to, to go under the rubric of NGOization, because also NGOization, when we talk about social movements, they're not completely delinked from the phenomena of, NGOization. Of course, that's a whole other conversation in itself, and the limitations in terms of their abilities to dream, their abilities to become more militant, for movements on the continent, right? In the last 30, 40 years of neoliberal globalization. So basically, these movements work transnationally, drawing power, learning from history, learning from themselves, being able to articulate their struggles, but importantly, working across movements. And this has been very, very central to the ecofeminist movements on the continent. The ability to work with, unions, the ability to think about the politics of labor, the ability to think about gender in terms of power, not just in terms of very narrow identitarian politics, which of course is something that, continues to plague various movements. So how do you think about gender in a much more radical way? How do we think about gender as an analytical category? And, so this has been very important in terms of thinking about, capital, thinking about multinational corporations, thinking about the nation state, and the battles that must still be waged with regard to the state, because the state continues to remain a site of struggle, across this continent, and I'm sure, of course, across the world. So how do we think about the state? How do we think about rights and responsibilities? But how do we think about liberation and emancipation for those of us living the long afterlives of colonialism, of slavery, of neoliberal globalization? So this basically is the context under which ecofeminist movements on the continent have operated. And of course, the question around what next? What next in a time of, it seems to be in a period of, especially since 2016, a period of permanent crisis. What next? I'd say that cross-movement work continues to be very important and very central. Resisting NGOization, there are serious critiques that must be waged with regard to the politics, the NGO politics that has plagued this continent and the movements in this continent in the last 40, 50 years of neoliberal globalization. Importantly, and I draw this from a quote from Molara Gundipe, who's now late Professor Molara, who has this very beautiful quote for those of us who are feminists, but really applies to those of us who consider ourselves as having radical politics or emancipatory politics. She says that African women Africans must theorize their own feminisms. We must theorize our own radical politics and imagination and possibilities and liberation. What does it look like for us? So I'd say that perhaps that's what's next, but keeping in line that, the imagined communities, but also horizontal comradeship, sticking to that and resisting narrow identity politics in our movements.
Great, Ruth. That's really, really useful, particularly that resisting narrow identity politics and the idea of of horizontal comradeship. So finally, let's go to Kali. Kali, let me introduce you. You've introduced yourself, but let me just expand. So because you're so modest. So Kali Akuno is co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson, Mississippi, and a leading advocate of just transition in the United States. He served as the director of special projects and external funding in the mayoral administration of the radical Jackson mayor, Chokwe Lumumba. Kali's role involves supporting cooperative development, the introduction of eco-friendly and carbon reduction methods of operation, and the promotion of human rights and international relations in the city. So looking forward to hearing from you, particularly about those models of alternative economics. So Kali, over to you for your 10.
So my son is with me, and he's a bit shocked to hear that bio, and is saying, how come I never told him these things? So you may hear him and some commentary from him in the background.
Okay.
But again, good morning. I can fix it for you a little bit later, man. Okay. All right. So where to begin? Number one, it's a very critical time here in the United States. That is pretty challenging for social movements right now. We are definitely kind of confronting a neo-fascist movement that is gaining ground and ascendancy without question here in the United States. But what I'm seeing, quite honestly, is a panic that is not tapped into it. The fact that when you look at the actual constituency and the expression of kind of progressive and radical politics in the United States, and I would argue to a certain extent beyond, but within the United States, we far outnumber the forces on the right. In terms of how many people are actually part of our base, part of our constituency, in some form of organized manner or some expressive manner. The difference between our forces and their forces right now is one of organization and one of finance, right? And there's also a critical component around the media and media exposure. Even the liberal media in the United States, and I would argue throughout most of the so-called, industrialized nations of the West, give privilege and position to them as a legitimate opposition force, and discard anything in our initiatives on the left as irrational, unpractical, and beyond the kind of the pale of what can be negotiated. And this is a point that I think we need to really harp on in terms of really thinking through where our power needs to be concentrated going forward. Because one of the things that I like to highlight to a lot of particularly younger folks is that in many respects, we are winning the cultural wars in the United States, right? And the power that has in changing people's both perceptions and ultimately, I think in the long term, can create new forms of socialization and then new relations that emerge from that. And in that regards, I'll tell them from a perspective of, being a little bit older with a few gray hairs on my head, like there are things that you all are discussing, ways in which you are acting, and ways in which you are being and not asking for permission that were unimaginable even to me 20 or 30 years ago. The way in which what we would call queer culture, like that would not be public 30 years ago. It may have had an underground expression or a small community expression, not anything regarding kind of a mainstream norm in the way it is, or it's become as a result of the power of the social movements over that course of time. So that is a war, if you want to call it that, a kind of a culture war that progressive forces are actually winning in the sense of expanding people's imagination of how we can be, whose permission or permission we don't need to ask for to be and be our full selves or more of our full selves. But what we lack is the political power to impact from our social movement, the actual political power, the organization to really transform what we want into law and to policy. That is where we are lacking, and where we, in many critical respects, have to catch up here in the United States in our movement building. And I think the impact that will have globally. And when I'm just to be clear for folks, when I'm doing a U.S. centered piece because that's where I'm at, but I'm saying that's in the sense of understanding whether we like it or not, whether we deserve it or not. The developments of U.S. social movements have a global impact, right? And we heard about like the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement. Yeah, don't destroy the house, team. We've heard about like the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement, upon other movements. But I want to bring in some things where there's always also another form of exchange, which doesn't often kind of get talked about, at least in the context of the U.S. I tried to mention some of that earlier in mentioning that, the indignados and that movement cropped up before Occupy. Oftentimes, I've heard in even in international forums about the power of Occupy, which denied the mass movements to a certain extent that emerged in Spain, in Greece, in Italy, and then the impact of what became known as the Arab Spring, and how that changed the radical imagination here in the United States. So keeping in mind all of these currents, and that we are internationally and globally connected. I'm in the middle of a piece, I can't pause right now. You okay? Give me a second, all right? I think it's in the bed. This is early in the morning for us, you all. So yeah. We've been going through it, so everybody's kind of waking up and getting involved in needing their demands met for play and for computers. Yeah, so coming back, I think one of the critical things looking forward is, with this kind of newer generation, is harnessing in our social power into a political power. And in one of the critical ways in which we see a particular bridge in our context, at the very least, is by getting involved in new forms of social relations through the solidarity economy, and using that as a bridge to meet both community needs, right? But to also to try to have a direct impact in the overall social relations of production in the United States. And one of the critical things that we have been really concentrating on is really trying to re-engage the kind of existing labor movement with all of its strengths and weaknesses here in the United States with the solidarity economy, and particularly the cooperative movement. One of the critical things that we've been really arguing for, and we see in a community like Jackson, is that, fundamentally, this is, as you heard me talk about at the beginning, our water system is basically, the infrastructure is just imploding. The empire system is literally, its infrastructure is literally collapsing. And that's due to a very deliberate and intentional capital divestment from our community. So Jackson is one of these places is a sacrifice zone, just point blank period. But it's left up to us who live here to try to transform the means of production on our own by either kind of incorporating what they have left over, right, and occupying it and trying to transform it, or making new developments in some of the existing spaces that have been either abandoned or kind of left to become more rural again, that we are now have to put into some new productive relations and capacity. And to think, in the sense that a lot of what we are doing now, and I think a lot of where our movements are having to adjust, our productive activities don't always directly correspond to market activities, right? Nor will they be able to in many respects. But what they can do is transform some of the quality of life by re-articulating how we move goods and services in our community. And this is the critical piece that we have really been pushing, because we're not alone in this kind of dynamic. Like, capital is not really focused on job creation in many parts of the United States. If there's a deeper investment in making more and more workers more precarious, making them more subject to, temporary contracts at best. And that's kind of the growing dynamic and phenomenon. And it's very much focused around kind of a intellectual labor, things that are done primarily like on computers. Well, most of the folks in my community don't own a computer, will never probably own a computer because they're just too expensive and too inaccessible. But what we are trying to capitalize on and create a new social relationship is trying to flip this dynamic of what we have a lot of is time. And how do we get people in new relationships around their time and their accessibility to put them in a certain kind of practices, like through time banking, et cetera, that they can relate to each other and exchange the goods and services that they need to meet all of our social demands and to fill the void that commodified society is not interested in filling or no longer can fulfill, nor do we want it to. That's the critical piece. Nor do we want it to, because what becomes associated with that is more control over our bodies, our time, and our energy. So this is starting to emerge, but it's very much challenged in that because we've been socialized in these relationships, we often still see in a lot of our work, folks kind of want to return to a monetized form of exchange rather than these new kind of communitarian forms of exchange. And some of that is, look, it's understandable, because we are not at a scale of production we can meet every particular need. Right, we're long away from that. Still want to exchange by, if I do, some childcare, or if I do some farming with you all, can I earn an income and then take that someplace to maybe buy something in the market, right, to meet up another particular need. So there's going to be some gaps in terms of how this kind of gets mediated. And I think the critical thing is, this is a space that at least we're now trying to introduce more on a local level. We need to be talking about raising an argument from the left about like universal basic income, right, or social income, to raise some particular arguments. But I think the critical thing is we also are facing this tremendous inflation. I mean, this is, I grew up with some of the inflation in the 1970s here in the United States, and remember that very vividly. We're approaching that same level of dynamic here, where people very clearly are having to make choices between, paying their utilities or buying food, right, on a mass level here. And that is engendering a great deal of panic in the community on a broad scale. And it's, in many respects, right now, I would think feeding the right here in the United States. And it's something that we have to figure out how to counter very quickly, given the kind of I think the consequences of what may happen here in the United States in the midterm elections in this year, 2022, and the national elections, particularly the presidential ones in 2024. I sadly envision the right winning both of those, and then in moving towards the kind of abolishment of bourgeois democracy as it's at least been expressed the last 50 or 60 years here in the United States. Now, the right has made some critical errors, particularly around abortion, and how the Supreme Court kind of played its hand a little bit earlier this year that might give some animus to the Democrats holding off this kind of neo-fascist movement. But I do think it's a holding off. It's not something stopping it. The stopping is not going to come from the Democratic Party. It's going to have to come from the social movement. So I'll end there just in the interest of time. Yeah, my question is to Sara. You had talked about the committees not coming up with alternative kind of economic models, right? At least to this point. Is that primarily kind of due to a lack of access of resources, or more or less to just a gap in the knowledge around creating alternatives?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons. One of them is the context in which the committees are doing their work is very intense daily violence. So a lot of the committee members themselves are hiding a lot of the times, or being picked up and put in jail, or some of them have been killed. So I think that is one of the reasons why it's been difficult to, because usually creating kind of alternative economic infrastructure requires a kind of space that has been lacking. They engage in crises very much. So for example, during the COVID crisis, you saw them doing a lot of work within their neighborhoods. At the time, there was less repression because this was supposed to be the power sharing, period. So they were going into homes, for example, for people that couldn't leave their homes, and bringing them food and doing this kind of solidarity mutual aid, which there's a very strong infrastructure within the communities for. Like in Sudan, we have something that comes from the rural areas called Nafir, which is like when you need to get something done, you call the community to do it. And then for 2 or 3 days, you do that, and they do that in different ways. For example, there's a lot of culture around the martyrs, the members, especially of the committees who are killed in protest. And so recently, for example, the young people would get together from the other committees and rebuild the house of this very, very poor activist who had been killed. Because they found, when they went to the funeral, they found that his sister and her baby were living almost without walls or roof. So then they got together, and for 1 week they did that. They help with medical issues, especially because there's a lot of, especially the injuries that result out of protest. And in the rural areas, there have been different ways in which trying to deal with the economic disaster in the rural areas, because there has been like decades and decades prior even to this regime of dispossession of rural livelihoods, of land, of seed, of all of this. But I would say that there is also a belief that underpins this, I think, at least from my conversations with different groups. One of them is that without a kind of a less repression and an environment where civilians are in control, then we cannot really deal with these economic issues. And one of the reasons is because the state is one of the biggest extractors in the country. But there are also groups that are doing work. So for example, other than the resistance committees, you have something called, I think this relates also to one of the questions that came up about the extractivist struggles against extractivism. There, Sudan is very much the African model of the resource extraction. So it was the oil, and then most of the oil went with South Sudan when South Sudan split, and then the government turned to gold. And at least 80% of this gold is smuggled out of the country, right? And it's all really, the mines are in many, many different parts of the countries around some of the most impoverished communities, and that are also, their health is being destroyed by the mining practices. And the owners are the militias that are represented in the government. The security agencies, the state security owns a lot of these mines as well, and so forth. And so they formed alliances called the demand-based gathering, and these are different struggles around economic issues around the country. For example, the port workers in the east of the country on the Red Sea, communities around the mining in the west and the north part of the country, actually communities where land was taken away from them, common land, and then privatized. And they have their own kind of loose alliance that tries to, on the one hand, fight in common for these economic rights, and to basically be able to again get control of the resources that belong to these communities, but on the other hand to also alleviate the economic impact of this destruction. But overall, there is a strong belief in the movement that we have to get rid of the current governance structure in order to be able to really build an alternative. I think this may change with time because this is turning into a very drawn out, long struggle, and we've seen other changes happen. But it's one of the weaknesses at the moment that I see within the movement.
I wondered if I could direct that question a bit to Mitzi, because in a way, building a movement in the Philippines is building a movement against, or in the context of a highly repressive reactionary government. And so in a way, you're facing some of the same problems as Sara, and maybe, you know, the same problems that will arise in the United States. And I'm wondering what kind of alliances and what kind of strategies you're developing that are particularly addressing that or dealing with that context of repression, and whether for you too the issue of economic alternatives is something to consider in the long term, given that this will be a long-term struggle.
I definitely agree that we have to change the economic system that we have. It's the reason why there is repression, because we're threatening that profit, because they want to keep business as usual, because they're afraid of the people who are mobilizing and organizing and resisting. What we're doing in the Philippines to build this is connecting with the different communities, especially with our working class and with our farmers and our peasants. It's definitely difficult and dangerous, but then us climate activists, especially who are from the city, who have the access to the internet and have the privilege to speak in English, we have this safety privilege that allows us to speak on these things more freely and to bring attention to these issues. And so that's what we do a lot, where we consult with our most marginalized communities and we ask them, what do you want us to amplify and campaign, and how do we help you? And this also means providing physical support, financial support. Their solidarity isn't just about social media and amplifying and campaigns, but it can manifest in very different ways, depending on what the communities are asking for. We have this network of progressive groups in the Philippines called Bayan, which has healthcare workers who are activists, artists, collectives, doctors, farmers, workers, indigenous peoples, women's, LGBT, and that unity of those different activist sectors, I think, is how we are able to fight back, because we know that we have no choice but to come together because of the repression. I think whenever there is great repression and injustice, there is also great resistance, and that resistance solidifies more and more when the repression is getting worse. But also the repression gets worse as you solidify more and more because you become more of a threat. It's kind of like that cyclical thing, but it is through that unity, and it is through that really changing the economic system and changing the material conditions in the Philippines. That would mean having genuine agrarian land reform and giving the land back to the landless farmers. And that really is the first step in the Philippines. And then, of course, a national liberation, so that we're not so tied to the US and to China and to the imperialist countries that are at play. We really need to have our own industries nationalized, but with that sustainable future in mind. And then working in solidarity with other global South countries that are doing the same thing. I think something that is a very crucial first step, a very, very tiny first step, but it's a difficult first step to take, is someone has talked about this earlier, but calling for debt cancellation against the IMF and the World Bank. And I remember Thomas Sankara from Africa tried this and was really successful and was killed as the movement was getting stronger. And I think this is something that we need to continue and we need to push forward as a first step, not even like the solution, but that first step is very crucial.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. It's interesting in Ukraine that the social movements there are making debt cancellation a key issue. Any other comments from or questions from any of the panelists to each other before I move on to the Sarah?
Just some comments. I mean, some of the things that were said were so striking for me and so interesting. I think, you know, with Nyambura, like the question of the NGOization aspect of it is so critical. And I don't think just in the continent of Africa, I think I remember, you know, talking to South African comrades about what happened when the anti-apartheid movement was successful, and this kind of skimming off of the social movement, you know, best and brightest to work in the government. And we see that on a micro scale in Sudan in 2019 with people who were part of the movement who then joined the transitional government and started to kind of advocate against the social movement's demands. But also the ways in which, you know, the NGOization, it's not a coincidence again, you know, I really agree with this. I think this is one of the tactics of depoliticizing these movements. So the question then becomes, NGOization has a lot to do with resources. You know, NGOs bring or have the potential to bring resources. So the question again, and this links to what Kali was saying, is where do the resources come from and how do we organize these resources? This is one way of fighting this. And we see really successful examples of that, I think, in different places. And then the other thing that Mitzi said that really struck me is, you know, it's so refreshing to hear about the climate crisis spoken about as now as opposed to the future, because, you know, being Sudanese but then living in Germany at the moment, it's so mind-blowing to me that they're speaking about it as if it's something that could hit in 2050, or, you know, literally we have birds dropping out of the sky in parts of Sudan because of the change in temperature, because of the lack of water. You know, the Darfur genocide, a lot of the dynamics that happened between groups that the state exploited happened because of the change in the grazing patterns and relations. I mean, this is something that it's not even the present, it's something that is coming from the past and is the present that we are living through. It's a life and death issue. So I think it's so interesting to me to think, and something I want to also take back to the people that in movements that I'm speaking with in Sudan, is how do we speak about it? Because it is there and people are living it, but we think of this climate issue as something, the language is not fitting to what we are actually experiencing. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question to Kali, if it's all right. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that ties, I guess, myself, Sara, and Mitzi, when we think about the US, I mean, the question of empire, right? I mean, thinking about Africa, for example, the amount of military bases in the last 5 years alone through AFRICOM, like the US is continually expanding its footprint on this continent. But also when we think about going back to a politics of transnational, transversal politics of solidarity, what space is there, you know, in terms of, one, what the movements in the United States, you know, in terms of like their own, you know, it's not, let me call it support, but let me call it solidarity in terms of, you know, because at the end of the day, you know, the question of empire continues to, you know, it's a historical question, it's a present question, and it's a question for the future. So maybe just to hear a bit about the question of empire.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the movements here are not as focused on anti-imperialism as they were 20 or 30 years ago, you know, 40 years ago. That's not a basis of where fundamentally they are at. There is an awareness, you know, but it's it's pivoted more toward a form of reaction, at least amongst the Black community, which has been something unfortunate. And to be clear with everybody, what I mean by that, there's been a very intense migratory patterns from Central and South America and the United States, basically since the 1970s, throughout the globe, but particularly those. And our communities have been very strategically pitted against each other by, the forces of capital. And you have in certain sectors and certain fields that were once reserved for Black workers, the least paid, most exploited. It's been much easier for capital to exploit migrant workers who don't have citizenship status, right? Who don't have, other forms of kind of legal protections because they quote unquote aren't citizens. They become much more exploitable. But that also has kind of created dynamics where certain sectors in agriculture, certain sectors in construction work, certain sectors in like domestic work, like folks have been the Black community is finding itself somewhat displaced, like from those formal forms of what used to be kind of stable employment, go-to forms of employment. And that's been highly politicized by a lot of Black petty bourgeois forces who are not about extending solidarity or creating mechanisms to create unity, but it's framed in the very thing that used to be used against us. These people are stealing your jobs. These people are blah, blah, blah. So that is being adopted more and more by Black petty bourgeois kind of political forces that has made a very noted, within my lifetime, market breakdown of solidarity that you would have once found of like we share a common enemy. We're clear about what's happening in Nicaragua. We're clear about what's happening in El Salvador, for instance, and we stand in unity. Like that, you only find that in more pockets. And it's very hard for that to break through into kind of your Black, more mainstream politics and expression through the Democratic Party. That's much harder than it used to be. The converse of that, though, is it's changing. At least I'll just again speak to the Black community, but there's also somewhat in the Latino or Latinx community. The diversity of experience is changing the definition of what it means to be Black and what it means to be Latino. So that's happening at the same time, right? And it's not particularly clear, like where that will go in terms of, a solid, concrete politics that opposes exploitation in Haiti or that opposes, encroachment upon like Venezuela or Cuba or, amongst the continent, in the continent. It still hasn't fully emerged there yet, but I see it heading in that particular way. And one of the critical things I think that will help it, at least this is what I've been arguing for with a lot of folks in my orbit. There seems to be that even while that definition is changing, there's still a reluctance amongst like Nigerians to talk about, American Nigerian, to talk about Nigeria, right? And like what's going on in Nigeria, or, Haitian Americans to talk about what's going on in Haiti to kind of a larger, Black audience. And I'm like, no, bring that to the table. Like there's things that we can learn. They're active struggles, some of them pretty significant, and a lot of lessons to learn. But if you don't bring that to the table, it won't be, brought up within your generation, within your context, right? So that's there. But this is, Ruth, this is one of the weakest periods in memory around a very clear anti-imperialist politics. There are forces that are trying to counter that. One of which, like Black Alliance for Peace is one of the forces that's trying to counter that and doing some work in that regard. But there's a steep kind of mountain to climb around how politics have been reshaped and refocused. Like, and it's not just, I've been talking about more of a Pan-African perspective. It's not just there. Like, there's a pretty severe backlash you would know it from looking at a mainstream American media, but there's a pretty severe anger amongst a lot of communities about how the Ukraine is being projected to the US audience. You know, folks are really mad. A lot of folks I know in almost every community, you know, and the folks who have done the best job, I think, of highlighting some severe contradictions have been the Palestinians. Like, wait a minute, how come we don't get the same coverage? You know, like we don't get the same sympathy or solidarity from, you know, the mainstream press or mainstream media, and that has really resonated. So that speaks to there's a level of international consciousness amongst folks in the United States that can't be tapped into. It just hasn't been organized yet.
Okay, so that's great, Kali. We need to now go on to the Q&A, and there are lots of really good questions. We're not going to have time to cover them all, but I'll just read out some of the ones that are coming in and ask. Some of them are addressed to particular panelists. So one from Fiona Dove, which addresses a theme which has been quite common throughout all the contributions, which is the role of women. But her question is particularly to Sara. So she says, for me, what's really striking about the Sudanese revolution is the prominent role of women. Perhaps, Sara, you could explain how this has been possible.
Okay, I'll try. Yeah, that's something that it's the closest to my heart, I think, of many of the struggles. But then I think, you know, everyone's seen this image of probably by now of Ala Salah, this young woman in a white toga, we call it, the outfit, speaking to the crowd at the sit-in in 2019. And I think it shows a lot, but it also hides a lot. Definitely, Sudanese women have been like never before, but also it's striking. I've spoken to people from many different countries who have had uprisings in the last 10 years, the level of leadership that women in Sudan. But I think we have to look at it again intersectionally, because whenever we talk about this question of women, it tends to fall apart to women. And that's very, I think in Sudan, like everywhere else, it hides a lot. It's very problematic because this has been possible for many reasons. One of them is that historical reasons that I cannot get into, but just looking at the last 30 years of the regime targeted women specifically. So the Sudanese regime of Omar Hassan al-Bashir was an Islamist military dictatorship that used the religion as a way of enacting into law, as well as in practice, very severe penalties for women for being in certain spaces, for dressing in certain ways, for trying to actually practice their livelihoods. So you see this phenomenon in Sudan of the different conflicts happening in the South, in the West, a lot of women, mostly women and children, being displaced by the wars, losing their livelihoods, whether they were farming or whatever else they were doing, and ending up in the major cities, selling on the streets. So selling in the markets and also selling tea and coffee, especially. So the tea ladies, as they call them in Sudan, this is a racialized group. It's not just women. These are women who are in the Sudanese racial matrix, are Black, from Western Sudan, from Southern Sudan, who are really at the bottom of the bottom in terms of not only the dispossession that has happened to them, but the kind of violence that they see from the state. So their livelihoods, because they were on the street, they were constantly being harassed. Their equipment would be taken from them and then resold to them by the localities and so forth. And you see that a lot of these women have come out in the revolution and organized themselves, and have been organizing themselves, because the last 30 years, women have been one of the categories, particularly women from the war-affected areas, who have confronted the regime, whether it's the public order laws and otherwise. But also the regime itself had a kind of it backfired its policy, because what happened is it expanded education, but it started pressuring young men to go and fight in the South, the infidels, you know, other Sudanese in the South and so forth. And women's enrollment actually went higher in schools, in especially at university in the urban centers. And a lot of these women also have come back and organized and became involved in the student movements and so forth. A Syrian friend of mine who was involved in the Syrian revolution has said that always this question is put as, how come women are there? But he said the question is, if women are not there, what is wrong? And that's how we should look at it. If you see a social movement where women are not very much at the forefront and engaged in it, that is when you start asking questions and see what is going on that is preventing them. I think the Sudanese women in their different categories, they have two struggles at the very least, multiple struggles, but they tend to be fighting the state, but they're also fighting within the movement itself not to be marginalized and to be included. So for example, there's a campaign by young women now to encourage other women to be in the resistance committees. So there are women, for example, in the resistance committees, but their numbers are lower. And that's partly because they're meeting at night, they're doing the ways that they're organizing can be often excluding of women's participation. So women are mobilizing within the general fight, but also mobilizing against these kind of exclusionary practices and also within the displaced camps as well.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm afraid we're not going to have time really to deal with many questions. If there are one or two more, but people could answer just like in 1 minute. So Ruth, there's one to you. What about AGRA and its influence on the UN Food System Summit?
One of the things I'm just very quickly, and it's also like a critique of the ways in which movements and organizations on the continent have approached AGRA. There's a lot of focus on what AGRA says it's going to do, like in terms of the policy documentation and whatnot. In terms of like, when they say that they're going to feed, this is how they're going to feed the continent. And then when they don't do it, like sort of like movements on the continent or organizations, which are anti-AGRA, have sort of focused on what they're taking basically AGRA for what it says. But my argument is this: we need to engage more with the ideological project of AGRA. We sort of forget what the original Green Revolution was about, right? Because in as much as AGRA hasn't been able to engage, to do what it says it's going to do in terms of feeding people, that is neither here nor there. But across the continent, when you look at the legislation, when you look at what you're talking about, its influence within the UN food system, when you look at, even in my own country, when you look at policy formulations or the ideas that the state or the government has around feeding people, around agriculture, they literally are ideologically in sync with AGRA. So in terms of the battle of narratives, the battle of ideas, and ideologically, we are failing. And that is where the battle basically lays. And not to just focus on what AGRA says it's going to do. The process of changing ideologically the ideas about what is agriculture, what is food, what is land, what is the commons, what is seed, who is, what is labor, how do women fit into a system? That battle, it feels to me every single day that those of us who are opposed to AGRA continue to lose the battle. That's what I'd say about AGRA, but it should actively be fought. It's a whole disaster.
Okay, and AGRA is the
Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, which is also headquartered in Nairobi.
Okay, so listen, we're going to have to move very quickly. There's one final question, and then I'm going to have to ask each of the panelists to wind up, as it were. So if you just answer this question like in 1 minute. The question is from Amitabha Sakar, and she says, identity has become the strategic resource in social movements. The examples are abundant, such as HIV/AIDS or BAT movement in political construction. The populist and authoritarian narratives are always very clever in constructing the identity narrative. How do the panelists think about the identity as a strategic resource in building a pro-people movement where people across the strata, social and cultural spheres can relate to the movement and participate actively? I mean, you all said something about identity, but maybe you can just comment on that question, and then I'll move to summings up. Ruth, I don't know if you want to begin. You're looking poised.
The question around identity is always such a hot, it's such a hot thing. I'll say this, I mean, just like nationalism, right? In the ways in which the, anti-colonial movements were able to harness or to think about nationalism in very, very radical ways. And there have been ways to think about identity or to use identity in radical and emancipatory ways. There are definitely, and identity is a really interesting form of mobilization, right? What I've seen in various movements, whether it's the feminist movement or women's movements, queer movements, trans movements, what we've seen is we cannot deny this. When I talk about a narrow form of identity politics, and especially one that refuses to engage with basically a materialist, because at the end of the day, what are people actually fighting for? When you go back to what Cabral says, what are people actually fighting for, right? So an identity, a form of thinking about identity without, for example, completely excluding, the material realities, the histories, or even how identities are constructed, and how also identities are absolutely fluid, right? And how the state, how different entities, the state, corporations, capitalism, basically how they mobilize identity without thinking about structure, without thinking about systems. We end up with very hollow, very narrow ideas of identity that can be co-opted by the right wing and by conservative politics. So for me, that is my idea of we have to think radically about identity, not as an end to itself, rather than as a space to mobilize much more radical work, much more radical vision and futures.
Okay, Ruth, any other comments? I mean, Nick's put in the resources in the chat a very useful reference to an article by Firoz Menzies, which draws on Amilcar Cabral, and it's so great to hear Amilcar Cabral being quoted. He was my hero in the revolution against Portuguese colonialism. Sara or Kali or Mitzi, any other comments on this question?
I will pass. I really admire what Nyambura said.
Okay, anybody else? Kali or Mitzi, do you want to comment on this question?
I just wanted to add to what Nyambura already said, but I've seen how identity has been used to separate us and to make it like an individual thing, like this is my individual identity, but identities are also collective. And that's what we need to bring back. That's what we need to use, as mentioned already, we have to use as an opportunity to organize. And it's so important because those different identities give you that different perspective, but we have to remember that our liberations are tied together. No matter what identity you are, unless you're like the capitalist 1%, your liberations are tied to each other. And so that's how we have to approach identities. And it's so difficult because it has been co-opted now. Now it's like oppression Olympics. Who's more, whoever is the most marginalized, their answer is the correct answer, even if there's no material basis, even if there's no connection to structure or class or economy. And that's coming off as a rant now, but really we have to go back to making that about the community and about the collective and about collective action.